Welcome to this course on EU environmental policy and European Green Deal. I will give 3 online lectures on these topics. Let me start from answering a question: why talk about EU environmental policy? And I can think of at least 2 very good reasons for doing so. First, compared to some other policy areas, perhaps EU's environmental policy is widely regarded as a success story. And second, since 1990s at least, EU is clearly a global environmental policy pioneer. That's the role which was carried by United States back in 1960s, 1970s. Then Japan had amazing environmental policy in 1970s and 1980s. But as I said, at least since 1990s, EU has clearly been a global environmental policy pioneer. So today, when you look at any global environmental negotiations, be it on climate change or biodiversity or some other issues, you almost always see EU pushing for more ambition, EU trying to do itself more, to push other countries to do more. So many countries and regions in the world are looking at the European Union to understand what it did right, what it did well in its environmental policy, which instruments it used, what is the reason for EU's success. So yes, these are 2 very good reasons for looking into these environmental policy issues. I will start this lecture from evolution or development of EU environmental law, and I got inspiration from 3 very good sources, and using those sources I divided the history of EU environmental policy into 4 phases. And yes, my sources of inspiration have been a very good textbook by Delreux and Happerts, Environmental Policy and Politics in the European Union, then a collection of articles edited by one of my favorite authors when it comes to environmental policy, Andrew Jordan, edited together with Camilla Adele, and then an article by Henning Detters from Vienna University, which he published in Environmental Policy and Governance journal when EU environmental policy turned 50. So combining those 3 sources and yes, getting inspiration from those, I divided the history of EU environmental policy so far into 4 phases, which you can see on the screen. The first one from 1957 till 1972, basically environmental measures serving the EU common market. Then the second phase from 72 to 92, expansion of environmental legislation. Phase 3, consolidation of environmental legislation, and ongoing at the moment is mature environmental policy, green economy, and better implementation. Now, I will very briefly run through all these 4 phases in development of EU environmental policy, giving examples on what happened. And here, of course, you see the founding meeting of the European Union, when the Treaty of Rome was signed back in 1957, a hall full of white middle-aged men, as you can see. What's interesting about the Treaty of Rome from 1957, is that it lacked explicit reference to environmental protection, which means that, legally speaking, in its first years, EU did not have permission to act in the field of environment, meaning the European Commission, as we know it today, did not have mandate or didn't have demand from founding fathers to deal with environmental protection. The main emphasis of EU back then was creation and integration of the common market, which meant removal of customs duties and quantitative trade restriction, common external tariffs, etc. So EU was working to achieve common market, and environment wasn't explicitly part of that exercise. However, the European Commission and few sympathetic member states, very often Germany and the Netherlands, initiated first environmental regulation of the EU, and they did so by claiming that these environmental norms, these first environmental regulations, are needed to support functioning of common market. For example, product standards. And when doing so, there were a lot of disputes, of course, in EU between member states and Commission, but the EU Court of Justice very often supported this practice, saying that indeed there are few articles in the founding treaty of EU, the Treaty of Rome, which can be used to enact first environmental legal acts. Back then the situation indeed in the European Commission was that there were no environmental experts, no environmental officers in the European Commission, there were no outside pressure groups, very different to a situation where we are today. And indeed, some member states continued to challenge the competence of the European Commission to initiate new environmental regulations. So there were many court cases where again the Court of Justice very often said to those member states complaining that no, indeed, because a lot of environmental regulation actually supports creation of common market, then it's fully legal to be dealing with those environmental issues. And on the screen you see a few examples of the first legal acts in the field of environment back then. Now, it's commonly regarded that a completely new or qualitatively new phase in development of EU environmental policy started from 1972, which was a groundbreaking year for environmental policy globally, because also in 1972 there was a big UN environmental event in Stockholm, the first time ever actually when heads of state, so presidents, prime ministers, ministers, came together under the flag of UN to explicitly discuss environmental policy. So after this big UN event in Stockholm, also in EU, in the Paris summit, the heads of state came together, and for the first time ever they gave European Commission an authority to deal with environmental initiatives. So for the first time ever EU got kind of bulletproof legal basis to be dealing with environmental policy. Now, back then, in this phase of development of EU environmental policy, very often it was France, Germany and the Netherlands who were promoting stricter environmental standards at EU level, and of course it came from a very understandable reason, because domestically those three countries had stricter environmental regulation, and they started seeing that if environmental restrictions and regulations and standards are different in different EU member states, it blocks their companies in exporting their goods, because demands on the goods are different, and it's annoying, it's expensive to fulfill those different standards in different countries. So they started pushing for EU-wide standardized environmental regulation. Then in 1973 the Environmental Council, or the meeting of EU environmental ministers, took place for the first time. Since then they meet regularly, several times a year. In 1973 first people were hired in the EU system to specifically work on environmental policy issues. The same year, 1973, the adoption of first environmental action program by EU, which by many is considered actually a starting point of EU environmental policy. Back then, still the environmental standards were mostly considered as being technical to help common market, but gradually there were more and more environmental legal acts. So by 1987 there were already more than 100 legal acts in existence on environmental issues. 1987 is another very special year for EU environmental policy, because this was the first time when the founding treaty or the constitution of the EU was amended for the first time, the Treaty of Rome. And when doing this amendment, and the new document was called Single European Act, EU for the first time brought environmental policy into the EU treaty. So there is a specific Title 7 where there are 3 articles talking about environmental policy, and the talk there is about preservation, protection and improvement of quality of the environment, then protection of human health, and third, rational use of natural resources. So for the first time ever, from 1987, the demand to be dealing with environmental policy is clearly written into EU most important law, so the treaty of the EU. And many globally well-known environmental principles were also mentioned in Single European Act, things like precautionary principle, principle of action at the source, polluter pays principle, integration principle. But still, the main kind of underlying goal of the Single European Act, including its environmental part indeed, was to support reaching the common market. Also, importantly, during this phase of EU environmental policy development, it was decided that when deciding on environmental matters between the member states in the Council of the European Union, a qualified majority vote is being used versus consensus on the issues. And why qualified majority vote is important is that in this case, one single member state can't block action. So if one member state votes against the environmental initiative, this member state can't veto the decision. So qualified majority vote was extremely important, that it was applied for in case of environmental regulation, because majority was able to enact, and maybe if there was a member state which didn't want perhaps to do that much on environmental protection, they couldn't veto those initiatives. European Commission also got mandate to participate in international environmental negotiations in addition to member states, because member states are always there at negotiations, but since this moment the European Commission was also part of those global negotiations. And there were lots of directives and regulations on environmental issues. You see it from the slide, from waste management to different regulations on water, nature conservation, legal acts and others. Now the third phase of EU environmental law development started from 1992, and what happened mostly during this phase was consolidation of environmental legislation. Well, the starting point was another change of EU treaty, this time called Maastricht Treaty, where maybe for the environmental policy the most important decision was the strengthened position of European Parliament in EU decision making. So Parliament got co-legislator status, which in essence means that Parliament got veto rights on important decisions. What it means for environment, it was a very good news, because since the very beginning of the European Parliament, when it was first directly elected in 1979, European Parliament has always demanded stricter, stronger, more progressive environmental policy compared to what member states wanted or what Commission wanted. So Parliament has always been kind of guardian of strong and solid environmental policy in EU, and once Parliament now got a veto right on important EU decisions, it meant good times also for environmental policy. Importantly, in 1994, European Environmental Agency was established as a separate EU agency or unit based in Copenhagen, which had many tasks, but maybe most importantly is dealing with environmental data, because you can't take policy choices, decisions, you can't see what's coming in the future if you don't see reliable data and trends back there. So EEA really playing important role there since 1994. 1995 is another watershed moment in development of EU environmental policy, because 3 new member states joined the EU, Austria, Finland and Sweden, and all those 3 member states already prior to joining EU were having really strict and good environmental policy domestically, so them joining EU meant another qualitative shift in development of EU environmental policy, but I'll be talking about that case in a moment. And there were new environmental action programs which are renewed periodically in the EU. Now, in 2000, Lisbon Treaty was enacted, another change of EU founding treaty, and what's important in that time of early 2000s was that we saw much more push for economic growth, competitiveness, and with that a ask or demand to simplify legislation. Something we hear today, again, a lot, but back in early 2000s this was clearly a policy focus for the European Union, for the European Commission under Manuel Barroso, who was president of the Commission back then. So there was kind of written between the lines that there was a push to simplify environmental regulations and perhaps dismantle or limit or relax different environmental standards. There were cases of that. Of course, a lot of new environmental rules were created also during this period, even though big global financial crisis hit in 2008-2009. So again, economic issues were on top of policy agenda, also for EU and elsewhere, but still in the background a lot of new environmental laws were created. You see here on the list, maybe most importantly, the Water Framework Directive, which many countries in the world actually admire, look at, and try to copy, because it was a groundbreaking new way of managing water resources. 2006 Chemicals Regulation, REACH, another big invention and decision by EU, also closely watched by many countries around the world, and many other legal acts in the field of environment. Now, what we see during late 1990s and early 2000s is that, as presented on this graph from an article by Busagani and Börsel from 2019, is that this grayer trend line shows the number of new EU legislation peaked in kind of mid-1990s, and since then there have been a bit less new policy initiatives in environmental field, while the darker trend line shows that the number of amendments of already existing legislation is still increasing, which basically means that maybe by a certain moment almost all of the environmental fields are already regulated by EU, so there was less demand for completely new legal acts, while there were more and more amendments of already existing texts in the EU. Now, the phase 4 in development of EU environmental policy, which started in 2009, Now, what became notable already a bit earlier was that increasing number of member states had problems in implementing environmental policy. So there was growing understanding in the EU that maybe we don't need so many new environmental initiatives, new environmental directives, because it doesn't make sense to have the perfect environmental legislation on paper if in reality member states, companies, individuals in EU are not actually able to fulfill those environmental goals. So the concentration of environmental policy making in this period or this phase in development of EU environmental policy was more in implementation of already existing rules, and with this came kind of a potential of weakening of environmental policy, the environmental policy dismantling, for example via softer or more voluntary instruments or later implementation dates or indeed weaker targets or standards. Now also what we saw recently after the elections of 2024 to the European Parliament was that the green or climate mandate was clearly reduced. So for voters there were other priorities this time compared to Parliament elections 5 years earlier. So yes, less demand for environmental or climate actions, although the current European Commission on the von der Leyen for 24 to 29 said from the very beginning that the European Green Deal will continue indeed, but competition, again, economic issues, security issues are clearly on top of policy agenda. But regardless of all that, indeed, the development of environmental policy continued. There are a lot of examples that I could give. I think the most groundbreaking or important policy initiatives were climate neutrality regulation or EU climate law from 2021, and more lately the nature restoration regulation from 2024, although at the last stages significantly weakened, but still I think globally taken a very innovative and new approach to nature protection. Now on this figure you see the number of EU environmental rules in existence from 1957 to 2014, and the grayer part of these bars in bottom show environmental regulations, and then the darker parts are environmental directives. So historically you see that most of environmental legislation was done via directives, and now we have kind of 50-50 situation. What's the difference? The difference is that EU regulation, once it's adopted by the member states and parliament, it's implemented as it is in all member states. So the text has been agreed and it's valid in all of the member states. While EU directives are, when they are agreed between member states, they give kind of more broad and in a bit loosened way kind of common goals or targets. So basically EU directives say that in future we want to be here, that's the way to go, and then it's up to every single member state to decide for themselves how do we want to achieve this target or goal or aim written into directive. So member states have a lot of freedom in choosing how to implement directives versus regulation, which is much stricter and applies to all of the member states. Now, again, another environmental action program has been adopted for a period of 2022 to 2030, and I just wanted to list here the priorities as an example of what the environmental thinking at the moment is in the EU. So there's talk about climate neutrality, of course, adaptive capacity to climate change, economic growth shall be decoupled from resource use and pollution. There's a specific point on zero pollution of air, water and soil. Still, of course, talk about nature conservation, restoration of biodiversity, and then another priority talking about production and consumption patterns in EU. And as I've been mentioning already, this kind of talk about potential policy dismantling or weakening of environmental policy has always been there in last few decades in EU. And in this table from an article by Grave and Jordan, they provide example of kind of more symbolic policy dismantling versus more active dismantling on the right side of the table. And yes, it has actually happened in reality that there is less new environmental regulation being created in EU. In this figure by Dimitar Toshkov, he compared decisions by different European parliaments, and you can see the trend line towards right, especially those blue parts of the bars which show new environmental initiatives being enacted, that over the time there's less and less new environmental initiative. As I said before, more and more amendments of already existing environmental regulation, because at the end of the day, if you have all different policy areas already regulated, it's difficult to invent something new. Maybe in last years there have been few new topics like microplastics and some others, but as you see, the trend is having less and less new environmental initiatives. And also on this figure you can see the blue bars are years 2004-2009, and then orange ones from 2009 to 2014. So again, here in the left you can see that over the time there has been less new policy proposals in the field of environment, while there's been much more new amendments of already existing texts in environment. Now, there's another rather complicated and detailed figure covering 20-year period from 1992 to 2012. So EU environmental directives and regulations, and those darker parts of the bars show dismantling of policy, meaning those cases where environmental regulations became looser or softer. And then the darker gray just next to this darkest part shows expansion of environmental policy. So you see both happening. So there are examples where rules get softer, and other examples when rules get stricter. So both happen simultaneously. Maybe more policy dismantling or weakening or softening in some specific policy areas, like you can see on a graph with ambient air or bathing water, for example, or drinking water, while there are other policy areas, and overall clearly you can see that Now let me talk about the role of EU member states in European policy making. First, of course, one needs to understand that member states have national environmental legislation, and it exists in parallel of common EU environmental law. Of course, national legislation can't contradict EU rules, but it's important to know that both exist in the same moment. So, of course, for member states, when they see there is no reason to have common standards in specific field, there is no EU legislation designed, because everybody is happy just having national legislation. Now, as I said earlier, in the kind of beginning of development of EU environmental policy back in 1970s, many member states had strict national environmental standards, and at the same moment common EU rules didn't exist, or if they existed they were a bit weaker. Now gradually, as EU environmental policy developed, it copied best examples from the member states, so environmental laws of the member states were being used as examples or good cases for the EU-wide environmental regulation. And today, where common EU rules exist, member states of course have to implement it. So there's no choice whether a member state wants to enact EU rules or not. Once they exist, every member state has to follow. Now, what every member state can do is that it can have stronger environmental regulations, stricter measures than common EU rules. That's something called gold plating in literature. What we see increasingly is that member states do not have this kind of more stronger national environmental policy than the policy agreed EU-wide. And from this table you can see just one example of that from an article from Journal of European Public Policy with example of EU air protection rules. You see list of member states and then comparison from 1980s, 90s, 2000s and 2010s. The policy changes that I have marked green in this table show examples where national level policies have been stricter than the EU common norms. So you see historically most member states in the case of air protection had stronger national policies than the common rules at EU level. But over time there are less and less examples of member states who still keep stronger environmental legislation in this specific field than the common EU norms. And one reason for that, of course, is that in the beginning EU rules didn't exist or were very weak, while today there's solid EU legislation on environmental protection and member states don't need to invent something new or to do more than commonly agreed at the EU level. Now, when talking about member states and what they do in the field of environmental policy, it's important to have a look at policy learning and regulatory competition in environmental policy, because indeed there is constant policy learning between member states and between member states and EU, because countries are looking at each other and trying to copy the best examples of how to regulate environmental policy. So learning from success of the others is a very common feature in development of EU environmental policy. Historically, social science has had more interest whether this kind of regulatory competition, as it's being called, actually works. Does it bring better results at the end of the day, or race to the top, or it becomes, or it creates worse situations, so race to the bottom. And when it comes to environmental policy, then the kind of early theories predicted that if countries are competing with their environmental policies, then probably the result will be that the environmental policies of the weaker countries will be copied and will spread. So there's competition between countries and they look at each other's environmental standards and regulations, and there was thinking decades and decades ago that this will lead to a commonly weaker environmental norms. Now, when it comes to the European Union, at least this has clearly not been the case. So there has been clearly raised to the top in EU when different member states have compared their standards, when EU started to create central environmental policy and regulations, clearly there has been raised to the top when it comes to EU environmental policy. Now, when it comes to policy competition and different rules in different countries, then what's interesting that sometimes private sector voluntarily chooses stricter standards, especially when it comes to those companies who produce very complicated, very complex, very expensive products. For example, cars. They're very expensive to make. And so voluntarily, without having any global guidance, very often you see that those companies do not produce different types of their products for different markets. Because indeed, air quality or climate change regulations may be different in the European Union, in the United States, in China, in other regions and countries of the world. So for producers of those complicated and expensive goods, it would be really difficult and expensive actually, to produce different types of, for example, engines to meet demands in those different markets globally. So what we have seen voluntarily actually is that companies are choosing the most stringent rules globally and produce all their products according to this and sell them globally, even if there is no demand or restriction yet in specific market to apply that strict regulation. So there's another example of how policy learning and regulatory competition works also on voluntary basis. And of course this regulatory competition is a term that economists use a lot to compare, to monitor how different countries are responding to changing circumstances. So very often economists measure things like you see on this figure, the strength of finance sector, commercial risks, regulatory permits, approvals, access to infrastructure and other fields. And when you mark different countries on those scales, then you can at the end of the day compare different countries, and the same can be easily done for environmental policy. Before coming to a juicy topic of comparing how strict different member states' environmental policies have been, it's important to underline that it's actually difficult sometimes to define high versus low ambition in environmental policy, or what's good, what's bad. Let's take, for example, the case of nuclear power. We have EU member state France, which relies heavily on nuclear power to get electricity, and indeed, more lately, nuclear power has been considered by some as a good solution in situation of climate change, because indeed, when you're running a nuclear power plant, its carbon emissions are extremely low. Of course, you have to calculate the entire life cycle, and there are loads of other urgent environmental problems related to nuclear waste and safety. But again, for France, for example, it's considered a very good solution for environment, while there are many other member states, including Austria, Denmark and others, which would strongly disagree. Or take biofuels. 20 years ago or so, palm oil was considered a very sustainable, very smart solution to other oils based on fossil fuels. So a lot of palm trees plantations were created by cutting virgin rainforests all over the place. Well, today we understand, no, that wasn't a very smart solution. Or take peat. Historically, there have been many countries and many people who have considered peat a renewable source. Well, indeed, after 1,000 or 5,000 years, the excavated peat will start regrowing back. But this time span is so long that surely you can't consider this solution being renewable. Or take case of wood pellets, if that timber has been harvested from natural forests or protected forests, indeed, that's not a very good solution. Or take big hydropower. Of course, hydropower is a renewable source of energy. But again, when you construct high dams in a very deep valleys, you may flood really valuable natural areas, habitats. You may need to remove thousands or tens of thousands inhabitants from their villages and towns, so maybe sometimes not a best environmental solution. So by stating that, I wanted to say that sometimes it may be difficult to say what's good, what's bad. And of course, when we compare different countries and their environmental policies, it's important to understand that, of course, one country's ambition towards environmental policy can change. You may have new elections, another party wins majority in the parliament, or there's a new coalition, and ideas and preferences and priorities in the country can, of course, change. Equally, you can have one country which is very ambitious, solving one environmental problem, but maybe a bit more passive when dealing with another one. So having that in mind, in the background, still many researchers have been trying to compare different EU member states or other countries against each other to see who's running more ambitious environmental policy and who's running less ambitious environmental policy. And very often those researchers group countries into groups of leaders and laggards, and then there's a middle group between them. And the leaders group, sometimes when you check literature, you will find other terms being used like pioneers, first movers, pushers, pace setters. And for laggards group, you also see the term latecomers having used. Now, on top of that, there's a good article by Duncan Lieferinck and Rüdiger Würzel from 2017 from Journal of European Public Policy, where they also distinguish two separate categories inside this leaders group when it comes to environmental policy. So they distinguish leaders and pioneers. And the difference, according to those two authors, is that pioneers want to do right thing, what their country thinks is right in environmental policy, regardless if other countries will follow their example or not. While for leaders, it's really important that, okay, you're ready to do something extra, but you want to make sure that you will not be alone, that other countries will follow your example. Now, coming back to the case of European Union, of course, EU has been enlarging. So when it started from 6 member states back in 1950s. Today it's much more. So on a map you see different waves of EU enlargement. And now when comparing the kind of strictness of environmental policy, different authors have been grouping countries. Indeed, a very juicy issue to deal with and to look at the countries. So when EU started, then typically Germany and the Netherlands has been seen as leaders in EU environmental policy. Then of the next wave of enlargement, Denmark joined this group. Then in 1980s we had new countries joining EU, which didn't want to run that strict environmental policy, and they didn't have it domestically. And of course, when you look at the table, you see countries like Greece, Portugal, Spain and Ireland, which all back then were not very wealthy countries. So understandably, they wanted to grow their economy, and they didn't have enough financial resources for quite big environmental investments, so they were not interested in EU pushing really high and ambitious environmental agenda. Now comes 1995, when Austria, Finland and Sweden joined the European Union, and as I mentioned already earlier, all those three countries were running historically very strong environmental policy back at home. And indeed, when they joined the European Union, then the group of leaders when it comes to environmental policy in EU grew considerably. So they had much more strength. So since that moment for the member states, for the Council of the European Union, it was possible to push through certain things in environmental policy which were not possible before 1995. And of course, since 1995 there have been other countries joining EU, but there isn't a good comparison done by researchers really comparing all member states. So I didn't dare to start putting countries myself into that table that have been joining EU in 2004 and after that. And now I come to a bigger table, hopefully visible from the screen, where researchers have compared mostly European countries, but there are some other countries as well, so ranking their environmental policy performance in 1970, 80, 90 and 2000. And it's very unfortunate that there isn't similar comparison going up to this moment. It would be really interesting to compare where those countries would stand today. But this research was based on a huge project funded by EU Fifth Framework Program called ENVI-POLCON. So there's an article based on this huge data set, and as you can see, the countries according to their environmental policy performance have been grouped into groups of top leader, midfield, laggard and absolute laggard. And I couldn't fit all the countries into the screen, so I had my selection done. You see, on top come Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Italy, Hungary, Belgium, France, the Netherlands. So European countries back in 2000, when the latest data was compared, I underlined members of European Union. So yes, Hungary back then was still not member state. And what you can see from the table, of course, the top group mostly being stable. There are some interesting cases of countries dropping in this comparison, some countries raising in their ranks. So really interesting research being done, comparing national environmental policies and laws of those countries and to see where they stand. And as I said, it's pity there hasn't been similar research done more lately. And yes, talking globally about environmental pioneers, as I mentioned, back in 1960s, 70s and into 1980s, USA and Japan have clearly been the global policy pioneers when it comes to environmental policy. Now, they have gone from this top group. In 1970s, there were several EU member states like Belgium and France very active, having very stringent environmental policies. Well, today in EU, not in the top group, unfortunately. And there's an interesting table in an article by Bush and Jürgens from 2005, when they basically illustrate the kind of fading back of US and Japan in this rank. So on the left you see situation from 1970 to 85, and then on right from 85 to 2000. So they looked at policy innovation and early adoption in environmental policy, and you see back in 70s into early 80s, US and Japan had 9 or 8 policy innovations, and when you look at the next period, it was dropped. So clearly them losing their top rank in the global environmental policy competition. And my last slide in this lecture, there's an interesting book by Anu Bradford, a professor at Columbia Law School in US, which was released in 2020, I guess, when she really interestingly looks at EU being global regulatory superpower, able to set global standards in some areas. So the book is called The Brussels Effect. And interestingly, there is one special chapter in that book when she looks at the environmental case. So which have been these policy instruments or economic instruments or those policy innovations in environmental policy where EU has been clearly a pace setter globally. So the examples she gives in her book are EMAS system, then chemicals regulation, REACH, electronic waste directive, and then cap and trade carbon emissions trading system. So who wants to see this kind of global positioning of EU when it comes to EU being regulatory power, then I suggest it's a very good piece of reading. So that's it for this first lecture in this series, so click to see the second one.